This week we're going to talk about cycles and textures and nodes and materials and that whole minefield that gets so confusing. As far as cycles, materials and nodes and that are concerned, I'm no great expert. I can kind of find my way around, but anyway, the end result of that is this video might be 5 minutes or it might be 2 hours. I don't know. We'll just see how we get on and how little I confuse myself with it. So we'll start off. We're in a cycles render, and first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add an environment for some lighting. I'm going to use a HDR because whenever Blender is basically a blank screen, we need to add lighting and to be able to see our models, to add some depth to the models, etc. So generally I work with a HDR. Once again, I'm using the Pro Light and Skies add-on, but your HDR setup will work. That'll be fine. I'm just going to make a slight adjustment here. I'm going to mirror the horizon so it shows up on above and below. I don't get the black line below. Let's have a look at that. So if I go Shift 9, no, Z9, isn't it? Let's see, I've got this kind of environment here that's also mirrored down. I've got this slight black line there, but don't worry about that. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I find the background distracting when I'm working on something. So going to come back here to the render mode, and under film I'm going to check transparent, which makes it transparent. As a surprise. Right, let's go back into a solid view, reset my cursor. I'm going to add a Suzanne here, so Shift A, Mesh Monkey, just something so we can see what we're doing. So let me reposition her a little bit. Let's just bring her up. She's very chunky, very blocky, so I'm going to add a level of subdivision. And I'm going to smooth her off. Right, so we've got our Suzanne and we've got an environment. If I was to render this now, it just looks like a grey monkey. Or go into render view, which is Z9. Start these screencast keys. Right, so she's just this monkey. She's got this very blue hue to her, all this blueness, but that's because of the environment texture, the HDR. In actual fact, if I change that to something more kind of diffused, try that one. There, still got the blue hue, but not as... It's more kind of even and distributed and not as strong as it was before. Alright, this is one of the disadvantages of HDRs, is that your model will pick up the colour from the environment, but that's kind of the point of a HDR. It's placing your model into a real world environment. Right, so we've got Suzanne. Let's bring this up and let's make this a node editor. And we can also add a new material to Suzanne. So there's a new material. And let's have a look at this. The base material in Blender comprises of just a diffuse. Okay, we can change the color of that diffuse. Make it red, green, blue, pink, whatever we like. Let's just bring it back to white. So let's bring that hue down, bring that up, bring that down. Right. So that is the basic material, but just about everything in real life has a bit of a glossiness, a reflection on it. So we can add a new shader, and we can add a gloss shader. Now we've got a whole list of shaders here. We won't go through them all today, but we might go through some of them. But let's start off working with the diffuse and glossy. Okay, and we need to mix those two together into the output. Okay, so I'm going to Shift A, add a shader, add a mix shader, drop that in there, and drop that in there. Now we're starting to get some glossy components on her. Okay, you can see it here around the cheekbone, on top of the brows, around the ear. The light source is from this side, which is why it's showing up more on this side. If I come to my HDR and I just spin that round, let's try about 70 degrees. It might bring the light more towards the front. Yes, it has. So you see now this glossy has moved across the face because the light source, the sunlight, is coming more from the front. Right, so we can control the amount of glossiness to diffuse mix with this mix shader. So 0.5 means it's half glossy, half mix. Okay, the further to the left we go, the more it's influenced by the top input. Okay, so that is pretty much all diffuse. Well, it's not pretty much, it is all diffuse. And the higher the number we go, the more it's influenced by the bottom shader, which is a glossy. So at a factor of 1, that is pretty much, well, not pretty much, it is all gloss. Okay, it's looking a bit speckled here. That's because of the roughness of the glossy. How to explain roughness? Roughness, if you imagine you laid a mirror flat on a table and you held a ruler or a tape measure of some kind against the mirror, how far up could you actually read that ruler through from the mirror by looking at the mirror and not looking at the ruler? And the answer is probably to infinity, because the mirror reflection is perfectly smooth. It has a roughness of 0. So here you can see, if I turn the roughness down to 0, we're starting to see our environment texture being reflected, just like a chrome bumper on a car or something like that. Okay, really high gloss, no roughness, but not everything has that really high gloss, and we control that with the roughness. Okay, and this slider is very kind of sensitive. Okay, it takes very little to really change the appearance of it. And if I come up, quite a ways, let's go halfway to 5. You see, there's almost no reflection left at all on it. It's picking up slight bits of the specular, but there is no reflection left on it. It's the surface is too rough to reflect it smoothly. Now, incidentally, a little trick here is when you're trying to adjust these sliders, they can be sensitive too. If you press a shift key while you're adjusting, it slows it down. It's kind of like an accelerator control, if you like. Okay, letting off shift key, it moves very quickly. Holding the shift key, it moves slowly. So it gives you that bit more control. Right, so let's go back into the diffuse glossy mix, in fact to the mix shader. For most things, you want a very low number here. You only want to introduce a hint of the gloss, so we want this very low. Let's do this with the slider. And depending on what kind of material you're going to make, normally you're not going to want above kind of 0.1. But like I say, it all depends. And even at 0.1 there, you can see that there's very little of the reflection, the specular coming through. Quite often with materials I'm working at values of 0.01 or less. Okay, that must still have a high roughness on it, which it has. Let me turn this roughness down to somewhere about there. Okay, a little hard to see, so I'm just going to turn this rotation back a little, say to about 25 degrees. Give us a chance to render up again. Right, the samples, that's something else we should talk about. We're working in a render view here, and the last thing we want to do is be waiting around for this render view to render. We want to catch up as quickly as possible. So if we come into the render tab here and we go to sampling, we can see we can adjust samples for the preview. Default is 32. 32 is kind of like a sweet spot for me. My graphics card isn't that fast. It is slow rendering, but it's fast enough for me to kind of get an idea. Right, so we've got this diffuse glossy mix. We can change the color. Let's make a red. Okay, it's probably going to be a bit easier to see things with a different color on it. So we've got this red and we're having this white kind of gloss come all over it, but it's looking a bit patterned. It's looking a bit what it's actually doing is it's picking up the pattern from the clouds and reflecting that all over the model. So I probably want a bit more roughness on it. Okay, so let me bring that up to round about, I don't know, somewhere about there, see how it looks. And you can see we're starting to lose a pattern, this kind of lines and bands that we were seeing from the clouds, and just pick up some of the light. We have some modes here for the glossy. Default is CGX. I'll be absolutely honest, between most of these I don't see much difference to the eye. The different algorithms used to calculate the gloss, I personally don't see much difference. I'm not saying they're all the same, because they're not, but for the most part I work in CGX. Occasionally I will kind of play around and swap and see if it is making much difference. The only one I do sometimes use is the sharp, and what sharp seems to do, if we let this render, is it seems to ignore the roughness. It just kind of turns it into a pure gloss, and you can see I'm starting to get these banding patterns again from the clouds. So let's turn that back to CGX and give that a second to render up, or more than a second, but as quick as we can do it. So that is our basic material. Okay, now with this diffuse glossy mix we can make a lot of kind of like hard materials. We can make things like metal, porcelain, plastic, rubber, you know, things like that. And it all depends on just playing with these couple of, not even this roughness setting here, because the diffuse has no gloss factor. The roughness isn't going to make any difference here, but we'll look at that in a minute and see if it does. So basically with these two values here you can make a mixture of materials, very basic materials, but a mixture. Right, okay, apart from just using these couple of shaders, I should mention that I am using the Node Wrangler tool, and I've talked about this before. If you haven't got Node Wrangler enabled, you should. It is probably the best add-on in Blender when you're working with textures and cycles and things like that. To enable it, go to your file, user preferences, go to the add-ons, type in Wrangler or Node Wrangler. It'll appear, and make sure it's enabled, and make sure that you've saved the user settings. Right, we're about 15 minutes in now. Let's take a break here. I'll reset up again and we'll talk about something else.